Kevin Stewart.
Mr Ross talks about a bold economic plan published by the Conservatives, but that plan does not include dealing with Brexit, which has stymied our economy and destroyed many people's lives. What does he have to say about that?
Douglas Ross.
I made it very clear when I announced this plan last week that we are looking not just for the coming months, the coming years, but the coming decades, because we know there are very scary warnings about the future of Scotland's economy.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Like others, can I acknowledge the First Minister has delivered his first programme for government, and while the Scottish Conservatives will robustly scrutinise that legislative agenda for the year, we will also provide constructive support where possible. And I welcome the pro-growth agenda that the First Minister says is a key focus of this programme for government, but it remains to be seen whether he will actually deliver on this, given the years of sluggish growth Scotland has recently experienced. And it won't be a surprise to the First Minister that we on these benches strongly believe that there must be a renewed focus on economic growth. Presiding Officer, I want to focus my remarks on the Government's plans for Scotland's culture and heritage sectors, both of which have felt the brunt of the pandemic, as well as deep cuts in recent years. And it was disappointing that there is so little emphasis on culture in the programme for government, because aside from announcing a series of new strategies, well-intentioned no doubt, there is little in this document that will give the culture and heritage sector confidence that their cries for help have been heard. And I sense a real feeling of neglect about this sector. And that comes on a day that the Edinburgh International Festival lamented the Scottish Government's approach to culture spending, making the excoriating claim that, and I quote, "The last time the sector were able to be competitive and ambitious rather than managing decline was 2008.
I'm grateful, Presiding Officer, to Mr Cameron for giving way, and I understand the significance of the points he makes, and indeed in my short last tenure as Finance Secretary I responded to a very significant request from, for example, the King's Theatre in Edinburgh for government funding to complete their restoration programme, which I am delighted we were able to take forward. But doesn't Mr Cameron understand the irony of the remarks that he is making about the constraints on the public finances, contrasted with the profile on public expenditure that the government he supports in the United Kingdom has taken for the last 13 years? I know Mr Cameron looks at these issues carefully, but doesn't he identify the irony of asking us to spend more money when he supports a United Kingdom government that puts in place a fiscal framework that constrains this government's expenditure?
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It's our privilege to live in Scotland, a country that is rich in its natural resources, its landscapes and in the talent of its people. We are currently world-leading in some aspects of research and economic development, but we all know only too well that Scotland is nowhere near turning her full potential into a reality, such as the extent of the economic challenges facing us. Just a cursory look at the Scottish Fiscal Commission's most recent statistics and the analysis of numerous independent economic groups tell us the very gloomy prognosis that Scotland is facing long-term fiscal instability to the extent that the status quo is simply not an option. We need a tax structure that is delivering much greater transparency. That's a very strong message that has come from Audit Scotland over many years. But that brings me to our demographic imbalance and the resulting effects on productivity and tax revenues. No country in the world is immune from these demographic pressures, but Scotland's circumstances are worse because of the fact that the size of the working population in relation to total population is declining at a faster rate. Over the next 50 years, the Scottish Fiscal Commission is telling us that Scotland's population could fall by around 400,000 as a result of the lower birth rate, and the numbers over the age of 65 will increase from 21%, where it is now, to 31% in 2072. It's just another reason, I think, for focusing on policies that will encourage people back to the labour market, and I do welcome the child care policy. I'm very attracted by what people like James Withers and Sandy Begbie have been saying, most especially about the need for a much more holistic approach to skills and training, one that is bought into by schools and colleges, universities and businesses, and a system which values skills across a whole diversity of the population and which values every institution, wherever they may be and whoever they may be, delivering that training. So I think it's my firm belief that establishing a sustainable financial position for Scotland absolutely has to be the top priority, exactly as it is for the Finance Committee of this Parliament. And I repeat that the current position is simply not an option, since it fails to deliver when it comes to making best use of our precious resources.
And I now call on Deputy First Minister Shona Robertson to close the debate on behalf of the Scottish Government.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. This year's programme for government shows how the Scottish Government will continue to support people and communities across Scotland to thrive and live more positive lives in a fairer, more equal society. The current financial situation is challenging. It's challenging for households, businesses and, of course, as many have said, the wider public finances. And I know that this is a worrying time for many. So within this context, the Government has published an ambitious anti-poverty, pro-growth programme for government, which will support Scotland's progress towards the fairer, wealthier and greener Scotland that we want to see. I want to turn to some of the points that have been made by members. I will only briefly touch on Douglas Ross's points because there's nothing much new in what he was saying. He did talk down our education system, despite the record numbers of young people entering our higher education system, particularly from poorer backgrounds. He also complained about the lack of affordable homes, despite opposing every measure to try and stem the loss of affordable homes, like the action taken on short-term lets and second homes. And then he talked about his bold economic plan, which really equalled tax cuts. And of course, it is absolutely right that John Swinney pointed out that on the anniversary of Liz Truss being elected into government with her disastrous mini-budget, that those lessons of Trussonomics haven't been learned, and what we're seeing is Rossonomics, that with bells and whistles on of a tax-cutting agenda that will cut public finances, and all of which we saw. We saw that with the Truss government. We saw the impact, not just on public finances that we're still feeling now, we saw on household finances as well. So the idea that Douglas Ross would put forward that proposition in the light of all of that evidence seems to me quite astonishing.
Will the Deputy First Minister give way?
Yes.
Kevin Stewart.
Before, I'd like to point out that once again today, Douglas Ross gave us a plea for folk to support his Right to Recovery Bill, a bill that still has not been published. And this seems to me not to really be a priority for the Conservatives, because their website quite clearly shows that their Right to Recovery section has not been updated since the 1st of September 2021. I wonder if the DFM would comment on that.
Well, look, in the spirit of trying to be helpful, as a number of ministers, First Minister himself, has said to Douglas Ross that we want to work across this chamber to tackle what is a very serious issue. But we need to see the bill. And when we see the bill, we will address whether or not there are elements within the bill or the bill that we can take forward. So I just leave that there. We cannot have spending priorities and wanting to spend more money without having the money in order to allocate to those spending priorities. So we'll not hear any of that. John Swinney was right to talk about the key issue of childcare and the important role of childcare in boosting economic growth. It is a single intervention that can absolutely not just tackle poverty, but can help parents back into work and indeed to secure more hours and more secure employment. It is absolutely vital, and of course it is at the heart of this programme for government, and it builds on the work that we have done, supporting the 30% of the poorest families who are better off by £2,000 due to the choices of this government. Rachel Hamilton talked about the issue of R100, a really important part of our investment in our infrastructure. But despite telecoms legislation being wholly reserved, we are investing £600 million in R100 to make that change happen. On affordable housing, boosting growth, we will invest £750 million to support the delivery of affordable homes. Also invest £60 million of this to acquire empty properties to use as affordable homes. Liz Smith made a number of important points, as she quite often does. She's one of the more constructive members of her benches. She talked about the challenge in the public finances, and she's absolutely right. And of course, we will continue to set out that challenge, not helped, incidentally, by the real terms cut in both resource and capital budgets coming next year. But in terms of that medium-term financial strategy, we absolutely need to take the action. And part of that is about reform. Part of it is about modelling the public sector in terms of the needs over the next 10 years and to make sure it delivers in a way that is efficient and delivering for the people's priorities. So we will do that, and if we can get support across this chamber to do that, then we will. And of course, on tax, I am chairing the tax strategy group, working with experts to make sure that we land in the space of having a tax system that is progressive and is fair.